What is up guys, and welcome to my latest video here on SPVids. Today I'm going to be sharing some beginner beat making tips, and don't be fooled by the SP404 Mark II on the table today. It doesn't matter what device you use for these tips that I'm going to share with you, it will apply to anything. So this channel obviously is heavily about the SP404 Mark II, so that's just the device I've decided to demonstrate these on. And just before we get into this one guys, there's going to be a lot of samples used from my packs in this one. If you want to go and check those out, it's spvids.com. I sell beat packs and merch on there. All those sales keep me making videos like this, so I do greatly appreciate it if you could go and take a look. I'll make sure to point out when I use them as well. Okay, so let's get into the first one. Now, this is going to be obviously quite a difficult one to demonstrate, but it's more of a philosophy when looking for samples, and that is to stop going for the same samples that everyone else is. Now, you may be asking, how would I know that? Well, there's two real things which I notice with beginner beat makers. One is asking for samples. Now, this is something that I, to be honest, never really did. I always wanted to kind of find my own samples. So asking people for the samples they've used, those samples have already been used by someone else, so it's good practice to go and find your own. And another thing to try and avoid is try and avoid these sample playlists. Now, you'll find them on YouTube. You can find them on streaming services as well. People set up playlists that contain loads and loads of different samples that you can use. But just think about that for a second. There's going to be thousands of different beat makers all digging through those, especially beginners, and using the same samples over and over again. So I do really suggest that as soon as possible you start looking for your own samples, digging in places where people may not be digging things on radios, on cassettes, on videos. Going that extra little step to find your own samples is really going to help your music sound more unique and going to stand out more, and you've got more chance of appealing to more people. So try and get out of the habit of asking for samples, begging for samples, and looking for samples in obvious places. This is pretty much most of the fun of beat making, I think, is going out and finding a sample which sounds quite rare or you haven't really heard been flipped before. So I really suggest you get into that mindset of doing that as soon as possible. Okay, tip number 2, and this one is a bit more practical. I can show you this one on the device. And this is a thing that I've also noticed with beginner beat makers, is that there tends not to be too many layers on the beats, and that is something that if you can get into the mindset of, again, it's going to really push and elevate your beats. So I've got some examples here. I put this little beat together just for the sake of this video. So I'll show you the first loop. Now, this is just drums and samples. The drums are from my Lo-Fi Drums Volume 5 pack, but I think this is kind of like a beginner sort of standard where you're just chopping up a loop and then putting drums underneath it. So it sounds something like this. Okay, so not necessarily a bad sounding beat, but if that's just going over and over again for a whole minute, then it's going to sound pretty boring and pretty unoriginal. So the first thing that I've done is grabbed a little sample from my Lo-Fi Drums Volume 1 pack. There's kind of like these ambient sounds which I've put in there, which I did with my Zoom H5 recorder, and this is one of them. I've chopped it down a little bit. Okay, so it's a weird little texture, but if I put that under that beat, I've made another pattern here with this underlaid. You can hear the difference. It just adds a bit more character and it adds something a bit different for the listener and makes it a bit more interesting. So check this out with that underneath. So that's maybe a little bit too loud, but I just really wanted to make sure you could hear that. So compared to the original again. And even that coming in a little bit later like that sounded pretty good. And then I've got one more layer on this, and I think this is a Ghostface sample. Yeah. Okay, so very simple, just a rap yeah, and then I'll show you that over the top as well. So we'll start with 6 and I'll jump to 7 and you'll hear that come in. So that really wasn't too much work, but you can see there with those 3 parts, I've almost got the makings of a really quite full and nice sounding beat there, and that's really elevating me from just a beginner beat. I've got some layers and textures going on, I've got the rap foley over the top. So layering samples like that over your beats are definitely another mindset that you should really get into, and there are some examples which you can use if you want to. Okay, my next tip, and again this isn't really a practical one but just the kind of thing which I wanted to mention, is making beats too quickly and not spending enough time on beats. I mean, we live in a society now really where everything is kind of demanded so quickly. We've got fast food, we've got Amazon orders turning up the next day, sometimes even the same day. We've got access to anything instantly on the internet. And I think that kind of mentality can bleed into other parts of life and not necessarily for the better. So especially hobbies and interests and things like that. You don't want to be rushing these things. There is sometimes a bit of a feeling of really wanting to do things quickly. And sometimes it can be beneficial when you've got a good idea and you want to quickly get it down. But on the whole, I'd say try and get into a sort of more relaxed state when you're making beats, and try and take your time to craft something nice and don't try and rush your way through it. Rushing things means you either end up making mistakes or it doesn't end up sounding as good as it could do. So it is really good practice to just spend a bit more time than you think, just going over your loops, checking some different drum sounds, maybe trying some different drum sounds, maybe trying your sample at a different pitch, things like that. Just spend some time finessing your beats. When you're crafting something like this, it's not a race really, it's about getting quality results. So take a little step back, take your time, and really focus on quality, and I'm sure after a few sessions of having that sort of mentality, you're going to see a drastic improvement in your beats instead of just rushing through and trying to make as many as you possibly can. Okay, my next little tip that I've got is about mixing. Now, mixing seems like a dark art when you're a beginner, and I absolutely agree with that. I think mixing isn't necessarily one of my strongest points, but I kind of have a good idea of what sounds right. Now, one tip which is really going to help you with this is don't mix your beat at the same time that you're making it. And I think this is a big mistake that beginners make. I made this mistake a lot. You definitely need to give yourself some space away from it before you come back and decide what actually sounds good. Now, a lot of beginners I don't think will do this. You might just be thinking, I'll quickly make the beat and then I'll mix it and make sure all the levels are right and everything like that, all in one go, all in one session. I strongly advise you take a break between making the beat and mixing it. It's going to allow your ears to have a little bit of a rest, and I'm sure you've had that feeling where you've made a beat, you've gone to bed, and then you've woken up the next morning and listened to it and it sounds like something completely awful. So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about, is that you need that space away from your creations to come back to them, to really listen to them properly, and then decide what levels things need to be at. I don't think a lot of beginners do that, and that's going to be a much better approach to mixing. Keep it basic. Most of mixing is just levels really. Just concentrate on getting those right, and I'm sure you're going to see an improvement in your overall sound. Okay, my last little tip is the lack of variations in beats. Now, this is another example which I can show you on the unit. So we need to get more ideas going in the same beat. So we don't just want one loop over and over like this. Like I mentioned before, it's going to quickly get boring. So one way you can do variations very easily is with pauses. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this pattern, and I'm going to make a little pause at the end. So we'll do record, and we'll record into this one. Okay, and when this starts, I'm going to press delete. Okay, I went a little bit too far there and actually cut off the start as well, but I've put those back in now. So we've got one variation here where halfway through the loop, we get a pause from the drums and it just adds a bit of variety. So we can listen to that now. Okay, nice, a nice little pause like that, and we could do one more. Let's go and do a pause at the start. So record again. We'll activate delete. Okay, perfect, nailed that one. So if we listen to 5 and then 13 together, we'll get a little pause at the start, and that adds a bit of variety as well. So that's just one example of how you can create a bit of variety in your beats with some pauses. That's already sounding a lot more interesting than what we had before. There's no limit really to what you can do with loops to make them sound different. But yeah, definitely start thinking about things like that. Maybe even just start with pauses like that. They add a little bit of something extra to your beats, and I think that's going to take you a step above beginner. A lot of beginners will just loop the same loop over and over again, but you really need to break out of that and try and add some variety. So yeah, try some pauses if you want to, copy those ideas by all means, but try and think of other creative ways that you can add variety to your loops as well. Adding in things like rapper foley's like I did with this one. And then obviously we did that texture underneath as well for the other example. All those variations, all those creative ideas, they're going to make your beat sound much more interesting and push you above that beginner standard. Okay guys, that is it for this one. I really hope that this helps you beginner beat makers out there. It's a long and daunting process getting good at making beats, but I'm sure these tips are going to really help you. If you're watching this video and you have any of your own tips for beginners, please leave them in the comments below. That would be really useful for the community. Don't forget to check out my shop for all my packs like I mentioned earlier, and shout out to all my members. I will see you again in another video very, very soon.